Hello and welcome, everyone, to today's session organised by British Pugwash. My name is James Brady, and I'm on the Executive Committee of British Pugwash, the organisation dedicated to providing a forum for scientifically informed discussion of the risks of nuclear weapons and other existential risks to humanity. I'm delighted to welcome you today to today's session, where we're joined by Dr. Marion Messmer. We have approximately 30 minutes or so dedicated for Dr. Messmer's talk today, and we have time for around 20 minutes of discussion on today's topic before we'll close at 3 o'clock. Just some housekeeping before we begin. I'd ask that you please check that your microphone is muted, and we will get started. I'm going to hand over to Peter Jenkins, Chair of the Executive Committee of British Pugwash, before we hear from Dr. Messmer. Peter, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, James. I'm very glad to welcome Marion, who has kindly agreed to talk to us so soon after doing a very good job of chairing a three-way conversation between American, Russian, and Chinese experts on nuclear risk reduction at an event at the Royal Society, which Pugwash hosted to mark the 70th anniversary of the Russell-Einstein Manifesto. I am particularly looking forward to hearing her views on how Europe should cope with the demise of the INF Treaty and the concern in some European states that the United States may withdraw its nuclear umbrella, as among her foremost areas of expertise are European security and NATO-Russian relations. Marion is Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House. Previously, she was Joint Director of BASIC. She holds an MPhil from Cambridge and a doctoral degree from King's College, Cambridge. Welcome, Marion.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you to British Pugwash for the kind introduction and the warm welcome. I wanted to start by saying that, as many of you might have seen when you read the news this morning and saw that the national security strategy of the United States has been released overnight, that European security is, of course, in an incredibly difficult situation at the moment. And the security environment continues to shift and change, which makes it very difficult to figure out exactly what the right course of action is. So I will try to answer the question that Peter put to me, which is what options Europe has for managing the situation that arises from the breakdown of the INF Treaty, as well as the declining confidence in the US nuclear umbrella. But of course, the wider European security environment is also shaped not just by the ongoing war in Ukraine, but also by other things that are happening globally, not least actions taken by the United States and increasing great power competition. So I try to make my talk as clear as possible and as structured as possible, but I wanted to acknowledge and recognize that it's an incredibly complex situation, and hopefully we can get more into it in the Q&A as well. So if you have any questions for me, I'm really looking forward to discussing. Also, just a note of apology, as you can probably hear from my voice, I'm unfortunately a little under the weather, so I'll try to be as articulate as possible. But if I'm a little croaky, then please accept my apologies for that. Before we go into analyzing what the security situation in Europe is now, I just wanted to take a step back and essentially ask what the INF Treaty was, what its purpose was, how it came about, and what role it played in European security, because I think that will help us understand what situation European states find themselves in today. The treaty was, of course, between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was in force from 1987 until the US withdrawal in 2019. And it prohibited both sides from possessing, producing, or flight testing ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles in the intermediate range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. It covered both conventional and nuclear ground-launched missiles, but not air or sea-launched missiles. And this is quite important when we get to talking about the security environment in Europe today, because not to foreshadow what I will be talking about later, but I'm sure we all have seen the role that various missile systems have played in the war in Ukraine, which is, of course, part of the reason why missiles are so on various European governments' minds today. Any weapons that were covered by the INF Treaty that were in either the US or Soviet arsenal at the time were destroyed, and there were mutual inspection protocols for verification. And importantly, the treaty also gave the right to give notice to withdraw within 6 months after giving notice in case either state felt that the treaty no longer served their security. And what we did see from circa 2007 on is essentially Russia registering discontent with the treaty in various ways and at various points in time. One Russian concern was that it only concerned Russia and the United States, while other states were significantly building up missile systems at the time, including, of course, China, which is a state that Russia tends to be very concerned about, given the long shared land border. There were also concerns about NATO missile defense systems that, of course, were aimed at Iran, but the Russian government continued to register its concerns about these missile defense systems and the fact that they could potentially also be used as missile defense against Russia or potentially even made to be offensive. In 2008 and from especially 2013 onward, the US government increasingly had concerns about Russia violating the INF Treaty. The US briefed European NATO members in 2014 and 2017 about Russian treaty violations and then declared its intent to withdraw in 2018, citing the treaty violations as a reason. So what do we actually know about the concerns on both sides? How legitimate were they? And so I want to say that we, of course, can't know for sure what exactly motivated Russian concerns or why Russia felt disadvantaged by the treaty. But I wanted to go through some of the possibilities just so that we understand what the situation was like, and also because it will, of course, still be relevant for Russian thinking today. So I briefly mentioned China's missile buildup that was already visible from 2007 on and has, of course, continued. So that will have been on Russia's mind. One thing that I always find very striking in a lot of Western analysis is that we tend to just assume that Russia and China are motivated by similar interests and that the cooperation that we've seen since 2022 will essentially continue and is a given. But the relationship between Russia and China is much more volatile than that and much less straightforward. And so Russia will undoubtedly have concerns about Chinese military buildups as well. And given that Russia and China share a very long border, there will also be concerns about Chinese missiles, what range they have, and what targets they could reach in Russia. Then the other aspect that was likely on the Russian government's mind was the changes in military technology, and especially what technology like drones could achieve, since drones can achieve some similar aims as missiles, they can have a similar range and similar military capabilities, but they weren't covered under the INF Treaty since they weren't really a big system at the time. Russia itself was fairly late to drone development, whereas the US already would have had drones in the time period when Russia started raising concerns about the legitimacy of the INF Treaty and the utility that it still had. And the other really important factor in all of this is that the Russian government pivoted around 2007 away from believing that it could work with Europe and that a collaborative security arrangement with Europe and the United States was possible. And instead, it increasingly believed that it could only make its position understood by force. So that was an early move away from restraint that we unfortunately can continue to observe in the security environment today, and that has become such a big factor of the great power competition that seems to be back in full force at the moment. So what does that mean for European security? The missile systems that were controlled by the INF Treaty are, of course, key for Europe because the ranges mean that Europe is uniquely vulnerable to any Russian escalation. This is, of course, for anyone who knows the history of the treaty, this is what motivated Europeans in the 70s and 80s to push the United States to negotiate the INF Treaty in the first place. Russia did suggest in 2019 that there could be a moratorium on the deployment of ground-launched intermediate-range missiles, but the discussion between Russia and the US never really became concrete or went anywhere, in part because the US claimed that Russia had already violated its own moratorium by deploying the 9M729 ground-launched cruise missile, which is the cruise missile that the United States claimed had violated the INF Treaty by being developed in the first place. A version of the moratorium that was discussed in 2021 that I thought was really interesting and perhaps could again become interesting when we look at future options for arms control, focused on systems that could strike Russia and the US, but not others in Europe. So from a European perspective, you can see how this would fall short. And you can also see a dynamic that we continue to observe where Russia is very focused on the United States because it identifies the United States as a, fellow great power that it could cut deals with, whereas European states unfortunately register a lot less on their mind. But of course, today in 2025, Russia has abandoned this moratorium completely. So that is now no longer on the table. I wanted to talk a bit about some of the changes in the use of military technology that we have seen in the war in Ukraine and how that has been influencing European thinking and, of course, European security perceptions. So we have seen in Ukraine how useful missile systems are in the kind of war that is being fought there. I don't really want to recap the whole history of the debate from 2022 to 2025, but you might remember that at various points in time, there would be some sort of Russian use of various missile systems, including some new capabilities, such as hypersonic missiles against Ukraine. And European states and the United States would be discussing whether arming Ukraine with certain missile systems would be escalatory or would be an escalation risk or not. Lots of these systems weren't necessarily covered by the INF Treaty, because if you remember my introduction, the INF Treaty only covered a very specific range of missiles in terms of the length that they can reach. But missile systems generally are very clearly back as a huge talking point in Europe. The 9M729 cruise missile that originally caused the concern that Russia was violating the INF Treaty has now been used against Ukraine. And this is the first recorded use of a missile that was outlawed by the INF Treaty that is now back in service. So in that sense, we can see how the demise of the treaty has led to Russia and the United States investing again in these intermediate range systems that can now be used again. And of course, these developments have been hugely concerning for European states because there is a significant gap between Russian missile capabilities and European missile capabilities. And having seen various missile systems used in the war in Ukraine in the way that they have been, has essentially highlighted to Europe that if they ever needed to defend themselves from Russian aggression, they would likely be at risk of not having a sufficient number of missiles and not having a sufficient range of missile capabilities. So in response, we've seen a lot of different announcements of investments in different missile programs, including ELSA, the European Long-Range Strike Approach, which was announced in 2024 and which would be a collaborative program between a few different European states. And it would have a range that's greater than 300 kilometers. There are several projects for this so-called long-range option. I did want to briefly comment on that because we, of course, talk about intermediate range when we talk about the INF, but these ranges are not necessarily universally defined. They tend to be defined by the geography in which they are meant to be used. So in Europe, long range could be anything that's 1,000 kilometers plus. So that could be things that are in the INF range. It could go beyond that, or in the case of ELSA, that's actually slightly short of the INF range. So when you think about what the utility is of defining these ranges, it becomes incredibly important when we get to a point where we can discuss new security arrangements for Europe and especially new arms control options, because a lot of those will undoubtedly include deployment limits, which will of course vary state by state depending on the range of the system and how far it could reach. And so one of the other reasons why this new emphasis on missiles really matters is because I think we can see how deterrence thinking is changing without us having a clear new theoretical framework for how this will impact on strategic stability and escalation risks. Because some of these new technologies, like certain drones and some of these advanced conventional missile systems, will now allow non-nuclear weapon states to hold Russia's nuclear assets at risk. And this, I think, is particularly significant because we don't have a blueprint, perhaps not yet, but certainly not at this point, for what that means for Russian deterrence thinking, what that means for deterrence thinking generally, and how that could lead to escalation. Russia has traditionally aimed its deterrence efforts at great powers and especially at the United States. And it unfortunately tends to see European NATO states as very dependent on the United States. So that means that while Russia is certainly concerned with some conventional systems in Europe, it doesn't normally see European NATO states as having anything to do with its nuclear deterrence options, unless perhaps it's about the United Kingdom or France as the two nuclear armed states in Europe. But what we're seeing increasingly is that some experts are advocating or proposing that complicating Russian deterrence thinking by having several independent centers of decision-making in Europe that are armed with these conventional long-range precision strike options and can hold various Russian assets at risk would really help because it would prevent escalation. However, one of the things that concerns me is that this could also be seen as extremely escalatory. It could especially invite a response with lower yield tactical nuclear weapons, especially if Russia is conventionally inferior at the time because it might not have been able to regenerate its conventional missile or drone capabilities, depending on when such an escalation might take place. So the conundrum that European states find themselves in now is that they have to find a way to ensure their own security, especially at a time where it is very feasible that the United States no longer wants to guarantee European security. And especially while we know that the Russian perception is that Europe can't be safe without the United States. But it also means that we're in a time where we are figuring out new security frameworks and testing red lines in real time, which has a very real risk of unintended escalation and also escalation in ways that we might not even have conceived of before. So what is the purpose of NATO extended deterrence in all of this? The United States extending deterrence in NATO was originally meant to serve several purposes. So, of course, it was intended to reassure allies of the US commitment to European security. It was intended to serve as a signal to the Soviet Union that the United States would get involved and that it had lower yield nuclear options already in theater to use if it was necessary to slow a Soviet advance. And what I think is really interesting about this is that this was in part because at the time there was a conventional European inferiority in comparison to the Soviet Union. So we were essentially looking at a flip position to the one that we have today, where European NATO states, probably even today, are likely to be conventionally superior to Russia. And then finally, extended deterrence was meant to play a really big role in preventing US allies from acquiring their own nuclear weapons. So they essentially played a non-proliferation role. And that's also interesting when we look at some of the rhetoric around various European states expressing an interest again in potentially acquiring nuclear weapons because they are concerned that US extended deterrence might no longer be as present as it used to be. So why is there low confidence in the US commitment to European security and extended deterrence today? I mean, I'm sure you've all seen various headlines and various statements, so I probably don't need to spend too long on it. I just wanted to pull together some of the various threads that we've heard, especially from the Trump administration, because they paint a very interesting picture. And it will also be really interesting to think about how this might be perceived from the Russian side. So the Trump administration has announced already that it will reduce the US troop presence in Europe, which could be a signal to Russia that it cares less about European security. As far as we know now, they will first reduce the US troop presence in Europe back to the pre-2022 level. Various NATO member states essentially surged their troop presence along NATO's eastern flank after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The US was one of them. And so what they are suggesting at the moment is that they will essentially go back to 2022 troop numbers and then potentially in time reduce even further. But we don't know the details of that yet. In various statements and speeches, including in the national security strategy that I mentioned right at the start, there has been surprisingly hostile language towards Europe. I'm thinking especially of J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference in February of this year, and then, of course, about the paragraphs that are included in the national security strategy that was published just overnight. So that suggests that the US is not just concerned about the risk that might be emanating from China, which is of course something that the Biden administration had also been concerned about and had already mentioned as a reason as for why the US would need to focus more on the Pacific rather than on European security. But there apparently is also a real change in how at least some parts of the Trump administration see the relationship with Europe. And that is, of course, very concerning for European allies that are used to decades of having the United States as one of their closest and most reliable allies. President Trump and other members of his administration also seem to agree with Russian great power thinking and the vision of having a world that is essentially divided in spheres of influence, whereby Russia would have a right to project its power in its near abroad, and the US would have a right to project its own power in what it would consider to be its near abroad. And that's a very big departure from the traditional role of the United States as standing up for state sovereignty, regardless of the size or the might of the state. And again, that is, of course, particularly concerning for Europe, where we have a large number of states that are smaller and that traditionally have less military power. So that has necessitated quite quick rethinking on the part of various European governments. Then there was, of course, the language that was used during the disagreements over NATO defense spending, where President Trump said that he would encourage Russia to attack NATO member states that were spending less than 5%. That's not the most friendly thing to say to members of an alliance. And so that, of course, sort of added both to the confusion of how committed the United States truly were to NATO, as well as to concerns about how Russia was perceiving the signaling. And then if you combine that with various European intelligence services estimating that Russia might be ready to attack NATO states in the next 3 to 5 years, this has raised significant alarms across European capitals as to how secure Europe is at this point in time, and to what extent it can rely on the US providing extended deterrence or any kind of support to NATO in an Article 5 situation. So while the Trump administration actually hasn't made any suggestions about the US extended deterrence policy, European allies are extremely concerned for their security. Something else that I think is really important in this is the UK's decision to purchase F-35As and the nuclear signaling that's involved in that. So if you think back to a few months ago, and I know that 2025 absolutely feels like the longest year in history where so much has happened, but a few months ago when the SDR came out, it contained a recommendation that the UK ought to buy a mix of F-35As and Bs. The UK was already committed to buying F-35Bs, but this mix essentially was new, and the UK government has implemented this decision. The F-35As are the nuclear-capable version of the aircraft, and they are the version of the F-35s that European NATO member states have purchased that are part of NATO's extended nuclear sharing mission. And so the other piece of evidence that we have around this is that the Federation of American Scientists has been suggesting since 2022 that according to some budget lines in the Department of Defense budget, the US is in the process of refurbishing the RAF Lakenheath site to be fit to store US B-61 bombs again. And those are the nuclear weapons that are, again, used in NATO nuclear sharing. So if you put these two things together, the UK purchasing F-35As and then also the decision to refurbish a site that was previously used to store US nuclear weapons to be ready to potentially store them again, then we are potentially looking at the first post-Cold War expansion of NATO's extended deterrence. At one point in time, a few months ago, if you were reading some of the commentary I was putting out then, I was doubtful as for whether the Trump administration would commit to this, but from everything we've seen so far, it seems that this is continuing. So that's interesting because it signals that the Trump administration is sticking with extended deterrence. But that's, of course, a very different signal to some of the other signals that we've had from the Trump administration with regards to their commitment to European security. I understand that there are concerns about expanding the DCA mission. And I think those concerns are legitimate, but one of the things I'm really struggling with at this point in time, where the security picture for Europe is looking so difficult, and where several European states have said that they might be interested in pursuing their own nuclear weapons, which would, of course, be a violation of the NPT and would further risk nuclear escalation and further risk collapsing the wider nuclear order. I do think there is still a role for saying that US extended deterrence could prevent further proliferation in Europe. And I think, at least for the time being, while we are looking at such a difficult security environment, that's something that is worthwhile, rather than risking having additional nuclear armed states in Europe that would be violating the NPT and that would be essentially adding to the total number of states with nuclear weapons. But I'm sure that we can discuss about this further during the discussion, because I don't think that there's a single right opinion on it, and I completely understand and respect that some people evaluate that risk very differently. So to recap, what are the risks that I'm seeing for Europe at the moment? I think one significant risk is that Russia might underestimate European NATO member states or underestimates the US commitment to Europe, and therefore then decides to attack a NATO member state, perhaps the Baltic states, perhaps along NATO's southern border, but this could be one pathway to escalation. Another really significant pathway to escalation that I see is that the hybrid action that's already taking place all across the European continent escalates to a conventional conflict, which then increases the risk of escalation to the nuclear level, especially if there is some misunderstanding around the purpose of some of these advanced conventional missiles that will be involved and that we have been discussing. And then finally, of course, there's always the risk if you have conventional conflict between European NATO members and Russia, that it leads to limited nuclear use, which then, of course, can't be controlled and might lead to further escalation. So these are three pretty significant risks in my opinion, and these are the risks that we essentially need to manage. So what does that mean for European security going forward, and how could we manage it? And I will just leave you with a few ideas on this, which are definitely not the last word on this, and I'd be really interested in hearing your feedback or your further suggestions. So I think there are two different pathways for how to manage risk in Europe. One is essentially in the current situation, so without there being peace in Ukraine, and then the other is if a peace agreement has been managed to be reached in Ukraine. So without peace in Ukraine, I think that Russia's great power lens on the world makes it incredibly difficult for European states to be heard without the backing of the United States. That's a really tricky position to be in for European states, because they need to ensure their own security and they need to be able to project strength and deter Russia in a way that Russia understands without accepting or inviting escalation risks that they don't necessarily want to invite at this point. one of the dangers in the current situation that I see is that European states are not involved in conversations between Russia and the United States, because that essentially exacerbates this dynamic that I just described. So Russia is very happy to talk to the United States about European security, and attempts for Europe to get involved so far have not worked. There was a recent attempt by the UK reaching out to Russian government to start a dialogue, but as far as I could see, this wasn't successful, and there's essentially no further engagement. So for that reason, European states need to figure out how they can show that you can't talk about European security without Europeans being part of the conversation. And I think a really big piece of that will essentially be that Europeans need to continue to stand by Ukraine, will need to continue to support Ukraine, and will also need to continue to invest in their own conventional rearmament efforts, as well as their domestic resilience efforts, in an attempt to become more resilient to hybrid action that's taking place, and also making sure that populations and infrastructure are able to withstand any further hybrid action, so that Russia essentially doesn't see an opportunity that is worthwhile exploiting. If we are able to get to a peace agreement in Ukraine, then we will, of course, need to begin to renegotiate the European security architecture. Everything that we did have in place prior to the invasion of Ukraine has unfortunately stopped working. The OSCE is incredibly stuck and bogged down, and none of the conventional arms control treaties that used to ensure peace in Europe are still working in the way that they used to. And in some cases, the new military technology that has come about is, of course, not reflected in these treaties because they didn't exist when the treaties were negotiated. So some of these new weapon systems will require new solutions. I mentioned earlier that depending on range and geography, deployment limits might be part of that solution. There will likely be a lot of dialogue around risk and how to reduce escalation risks. And I think here it will be incredibly important that we get to a good foundation of track 2 and track 1.5 conversations, where we can explore some of these risks and risk perceptions without unnecessarily politicizing the conversation. Something that some of you might have heard me advocate for a few years now is new and more comprehensive incident at sea agreements. We've, of course, seen especially the Baltic Sea become particularly congested and contested over the last few years, as Sweden and Finland have also joined NATO. And the incident at sea agreements that do exist date back to the 60s and 70s, and again, don't include some new weapon systems that we do see today. Other possibilities are notification systems for missile launches, tests, and so on. And the big question that we will, of course, have to resolve in all of this will remain around Russian intentions, how Russia sees the world, and how we can begin to rebuild trust, without which security arrangements in Europe won't necessarily work out. So hopefully we can take some of the confidence building measures that we have previously had in place and that we have previously used, such as scientific and technical dialogues, to restart engaging with one another. So this is, of course, not comprehensive, and as I said, really looking forward to your discussions. But I think even the steps that I outlined are going to be incredibly difficult to reach and incredibly difficult to get agreement on. So I'll leave it here, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marion. Really interesting and comprehensive overview of the issues facing Europe at the moment. I'm going to open the floor for questions. I can also ask, if you have a question, if you would rather pose it as a question in the chat, you're very welcome to. I will come to questions in the order that they appear on my screen. I see a number of points raised in the chat already about the F-35s and the deployment of the B-61-12s at Lakenheath. I think that might already be addressed, but I'll leave it up to Marion to decide if she would like to talk about that further. And I can see Stephen Young, you have your hand raised. If you would like to unmute yourself and pose your question, please.
Thanks. Thank you, Marion. Very interesting stuff. Indeed, and lots at stake, obviously. Sorry if I may have missed this. I had to step away for a couple minutes, but did you talk at all about this discussion about a European independent nuclear force without the US, basically, with if Trump being so wishy-washy, useless as an ally? What's your take on talks about between the French and the UK around a more European nuclear defense option?
James, do you want me to respond one by one, or how do you want me to do this?
We can take a couple of questions at a time.
Okay.
You might be able to synthesize a couple of the questions and answers. They might come together. I can see Tom, you have your hand raised. Tom Covert, please go ahead.
Could you please comment on the considerable lobbying activities, both in the UK and in the US, by the company Lockheed Martin? um, in fact, they're more or less sort of quite infamous in approaching in all party committees in Parliament and making parliamentarians very aware of the sort of wares that they offer, like the F-35 and, of course, the B-6112. So my contention is, was Keir Starmer's decision to announce to NATO that the UK was going to buy F-35s entirely uninfluenced by Lockheed Martin? That's it.
Thank you very much, Tom.
James, you muted yourself. We can't hear you, sorry.
Thank you. I can see another question as well, just this third question, and we maybe if you'd like to respond to this set at this point. Question from Ayman Nizar in the chat. To what extent do you assess the risk that Russia's miscalculation of viewing European states as militarily weak could lead to escalation?
Thank you. Three really good questions. So, Stephen, no, I didn't really talk about the what options there are for a European independent nuclear force, but really happy to do so now. As you saw, my talk already got quite long, just trying to combine the INF Treaty and sort of conventional missile programs in Europe and what that could look like for escalation and risk reduction and arms control and so on. Yes, you are right that there are a lot of discussions at the moment about what European nuclear deterrence could look like. I think just for completeness sake, I'll sort of discuss all the options that I've heard and will then say what I think the most realistic option is. So I really briefly mentioned in my talk that various European states have expressed an interest in acquiring their own nuclear capability because they are very concerned about what is happening with Russia and about potential US abandonment. I think this is probably the most unrealistic option, simply because it would take a lot of time. The states would open themselves up to a lot of risk while trying to get there, especially if there is no US cover for a nuclear program. And it would obviously massively violate various international agreements, including the NPT, and would probably open the door to wider nuclear proliferation, which isn't in anyone's interest and which those governments would hopefully see if they look beyond the immediate threat from Russia. Then the other option that's of course discussed is to what extent the UK and France can perhaps cooperate more. The most significant announcement we've seen on this was the Northwood Declaration, which came earlier this year, where the UK and France said that they could coordinate their deterrence. And they already had some agreements whereby they can cooperate on nuclear programs generally, which they apparently intend to continue to do and potentially to expand. But there hasn't been much public about, and I wouldn't expect there to be much public about any joint systems. But one of the arguments that I made in the spring, which I've since heard from many French colleagues telling me that this would never happen, is that, of course, one of the simplest ways of making sure that there seemed to be a European nuclear option is for France to join the nuclear planning group in NATO. The reason why I think this would be simplest is because you would essentially be building on an architecture that already exists, and it would be a strong signal to Russia while also being essentially free to do. However, France, for the time being, does not want to take this step, so I don't think we will see that, but we are, I think, going to see more and more bilateral coordination between the UK and France, and I guess they are hopeful that that will signal to Russia. I don't think we will see an attempt to replicate US nuclear sharing, in part because British and French nuclear programs look very different from the US program, and they wouldn't be able to deploy nuclear weapons. And also, if you look at geographies, I think there's a limited utility to deploy nuclear weapons in that way. But what has been discussed is whether French Rafales could essentially rotate through various allied capitals, including on NATO's border, and whether that could be an additional deterrent signal. That hasn't happened yet, but this is something that could be implemented relatively easily. On the question of Lockheed Martin lobbying, I mean, we've seen various defense companies really step up their lobbying as there is more money in the system. So I think Lockheed Martin isn't necessarily the only one. I don't think, though, that the UK decided to go for the F-35 option just because Lockheed Martin is lobbying. The F-35 is also an incredibly advanced aircraft where there aren't necessarily good alternatives that are on the market at the moment. So in a way, especially if the UK wanted to participate in NATO dual capable aircraft program, then that is the only option that's available there. And so I think that probably the alliance politics of it and the UK's desire to rejoin extended deterrence was probably a more significant factor than simply lobbying efforts. And I saw that there was some back and forth on this already in the chat, but the other thing that I would just want to point out is that even if B-61s end up deployed to the UK at some point, which it looks like they probably will, though it's not clear whether they have been deployed yet. At this point, that's not the UK purchasing B-61s. That's essentially a similar arrangement to the one that already exists in other European NATO member states that host these weapons, but they remain US weapons, usually under US protection and certainly under US operational control. So just wanted to also clarify that. And then finally, the question on the risk that Russia might miscalculate because it views European states as militarily weak. Yeah, I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear, but that was essentially one of the big risks I was talking about in my presentation. Russia, for the time being, seems to assess Europe as essentially being very dependent on the United States and not having sufficient conventional capabilities of their own, and certainly not the political will, right, to use those capabilities to withstand any aggression from Russia. And so that is my worry, that we might essentially look at a miscalculation that looks really similar to the miscalculation that we have seen around Russia's decision to invade Ukraine, in the sense that Russia also thought that Ukraine was an easy target, which certainly has not turned out to be the case. And we find ourselves, 3 years on in an ongoing war in Europe, that risk of escalating further. And so that's essentially the risk that I see here as well, right? That Russia might assess NATO as being less cohesive or having less solidarity for one another, and therefore the Baltic states or perhaps Bulgaria or another southern state could be an easy target that Russia might want to take on just to test red lines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marion. I can see, Tom, that you have your hand raised. I would just ask if you could hold on for a moment and we can take any other questions just to make sure that we have as broad an opportunity to take as many questions as possible from as many different people before I come to you. At the moment, I don't see any. So I might first go to Matthew and then Tim, and Tom. I'll give you an opportunity after that if that's okay. Matthew, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I had a kind of broad question about, I guess, the kind of Trump effect, as in a few years down the line, if we have a kind of internationalist, democratic president coming into power, how much do these fundamental questions about European security change? Are we having a completely different conversation, or is it more about, the influence of Russia? As in, are these kind of long-term structural factors that won't change with a kind of change in presidential leadership, or is it something that could kind of essentially be overturned to a degree in 3 years, 2 years, whatever it is?
Thank you. Tim.
Yep, hi there. Sorry if I missed this in your presentation, Marion, but could you make a comment on US missile defense in Eastern Europe? For example, claims by Russia that they could have an offensive capability and that the deployment violated the INF Treaty, because you talked about the INF, but I'm not sure if I heard you talk about that specifically. Thanks.
And Tom.
Yeah, sorry to be a bit greedy about this, but the F-35 is described as a fifth generation weapon, and all sorts of hype accompanies it. So isn't it a little off-putting that there have been over 29 crashes, albeit in the United States, and that these weapons, we're certain in CAD that they're deployed, because we've seen video from Newt Watch at Lakenheath, that the potential arming of an aircraft that has a record of crashing with a nuclear weapon sends shivers down my spine. So maybe Marion can comment on that safety record of the F-35s. And it's not just, we've had them fall off aircraft carriers in the UK in 2021. So there's all sorts of issues with how they perform, and not very good explanations of what has happened to their systems where they operate in hostile environments. And of course, now they're being sold to Saudi Arabia. So there you go. I'll shut up there because I've had plenty of time to put questions.
Thank you, Tom. Marion, please, if you'd like to respond to those.
Yeah, sure. So might there be a future US administration that's more friendly towards Europe again? I mean, I sure hope so, but I think even if there was to be a complete change in the US again, and we might have a Democratic president or even a Republican president that is less focused on a MAGA agenda, there have been so many challenges within the United States, and there's so much that needs that will need a future president's attention within the United States, that I don't see Europe returning to the top of the US agenda anytime soon. The other point I would also just make is that we can actually go as far back as the Obama presidency to see the US more and more focus on the Pacific. So to some extent, this is a pivot that was coming, right? It's just that I suppose we didn't really expect the US to also be actively hostile towards Europe, rather than just perhaps more passively disengaging in a phased approach. So perhaps the extent to which this is a scary development might differ. But also, if we look at everything that has happened this calendar year alone, and the fact that we still have 3 more calendar years of this to come, that's quite a lot that can happen in that time period. So I personally don't hold much hope that things will all of a sudden be much rosier in 2029 or 2030. And 3 years is also quite a lot of time, especially again, if we overlay that with the intelligence assessments that I cited that actually see the risk of opportunistic Russian actions being particularly high in that time period. So I was already quite disconcerted how much Europeans were happy to just wait and see in 2016 to 2020. And I certainly don't think that just waiting and seeing is necessarily a good course of action for the next 3 years. Then talking about US missile defense in Eastern Europe and whether that might have violated the INF Treaty, it's a really good question, Tim. And I did write about this in my PhD, but I didn't refresh my memory on all the details before this talk. So this is from memory and might be a bit sketchy, for which I apologize. But the concern was that some of the missile defense systems that were deployed in the Aegis Ashore systems in Poland and Romania could essentially be just used as a missile launcher, so like as an offensive capability. Apparently, this is indeed technically possible, but there was some sort of a safeguard in the system that the US and NATO allies were willing to demonstrate to Russia and offer essentially inspection visits that Russia, for some reason, did not want to take up. So the US maintained that because these systems were in their defensive mode, they didn't violate the INF Treaty, and they offered to essentially for Russia to have some sort of inspection visit to verify that themselves. But as far as I know, Russia never wanted to take them up on this for reasons that I don't quite understand, because this could have been resolved fairly easily, I think. And then the question about nuclear safety and operational safety. I don't know whether 29 crashes is a lot or a little, right? Like that depends a bit on the number of test flights and so on. But I completely hear your concern about having nuclear weapons in an unsafe environment. And as you mentioned yourself, there are plenty of other examples of nuclear weapons being lost or being accessible or being dropped. We did actually write a report about this back in 2022. I think it came out around this time in 2022, where we looked at what kind of behavioral insights you could implement in order to make sure that those kind of mistakes don't take place, and you can essentially increase the safety of how you handle nuclear weapons to reduce the risk of accident. So I'd recommend having a look at that. But of course, as long as nuclear weapons exist, the risk is never going to be zero, which is the best argument, I think, for moving towards disarmament, of course. It's just tricky to balance at a time when clearly the dial is going in the opposite direction.
Thank you very much. I can see there is a question in the chat from Adora Lear, who poses the question, what could be the long-term impact of US withdrawal from Europe to its relationship with Russia? If you'd like to come to that. If there's any other questions at this point, I can see we're coming up close to the hour. So if there's any other questions, there's a final opportunity. Otherwise, I might pose just a question of my own. What specific technologies do you see as playing a role in the advancement of European conventional missile systems? Is there anything in particular that you see as particularly important in what European armament policy is kind of focusing on at the moment?
Thanks. Two really good questions. I mean, the question on long-term impacts of US withdrawal from Europe to its relationship with Russia, there are so many ways to answer that because there are lots of different factors in that, right? So if we were to assume a continuation of the current relationship between the Trump administration and the Putin government, then I think there's essentially some sort of accommodation where the two agree on a division of the world into spheres of influence. And as long as they don't bother each other in those spheres of influence, there's some sort of stability. But that's, of course, not exactly great for the states that then find themselves with a great power in its area that feels it can do whatever it wants. There are other ways where the US might still decide to withdraw from Europe and not involving itself in European security, where its relationship with Russia is not so settled, because they might still clash about competing interests elsewhere, whether that's on the African continent, whether that's in Asia. So yeah, a bit tricky to answer because there's lots of different scenarios depending on other interests that they're pursuing and political alignments and so on. And then the question around the role of advanced technology in conventional missiles. I think the most important technology there, of course, is space technology and space-based enablers. So whether that's the possibility to target those missiles precisely through position navigation and targeting satellites, whether that's advanced intelligence, that's essentially going to be key. And we have already also seen European states invest in that increasingly in a way that we haven't before. In part, that's also driven by the fact that European states used to rely almost exclusively on the United States to provide some of those enabling technologies. And in part, that is because we've seen let's say, ambiguous companies like Starlink move into this realm, where you might think you're purchasing a service contract, but it might actually turn out that that then is also used for political purposes, depending on how things go in a certain conflict, as we've also seen in Ukraine. So there's, I think, less and less of an appetite among European capitals to outsource such a key technology to what could be an unreliable ally.
Thank you so much for your time today. And thanks very much for all of your engagement with Pugwash's questions during today's session. Dr. Messmer, we really appreciate it. We are coming up on 3 o'clock, so I'm going to call a close to today's session. Thanks everybody who has attended today. Really appreciate that everybody could come to Dr. Messmer's session, and for sharing your thoughts on an issue that is of such strategic importance for the future of Europe. I'd like to invite everybody who has attended today, if you are not yet a member of British Pugwash, there is a link in the chat for if you'd like to join as a member. I'd once again like to thank Marion for your time and for all of your thoughts at today's session. Please keep an eye out for our future invitations for our next session, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks all for attending, and I'm going to bring a close to today's session. Thanks all.